Hey guys, and welcome to an episode of Mainstream Media Shills, where we're going to focus on the continued lack of integrity and willingness for journalists, old and new, to tirelessly make it their life's work to maintain the corporate media's main function, to protect existing power structures, the status quo, and occasionally to shill for American foreign policy when it's really important. The purpose of this new series will be to start holding individual journalists accountable because over and over again, they keep getting it wrong. They continue to promote conflicts, and they just seem to be able to get away with it and start fresh each time on the next campaign, and people just continually, mindlessly believe them once again. Furthermore, many of these journalists will regularly put ordinary folks who stand up against the mainstream narrative on blast. They'll do hit pieces on them, or they'll engage them in a hostile manner, asking superficial questions with the sole purpose of character assassination and sending a message to other people who are even daring to think about standing out of line. It's in complete contrast to how they engage people who support their narratives. Through this process, we can learn about how anti-China or anti-flavor of the month, whatever it is, narratives are built, twisted, and presented in order to not inform or explore, but to influence and mislead you into specific conclusions. With that in mind, it's time to start focusing on these individual shills and look at what it is they do and how they do it, twisting and turning to protect the narrative or produce what their corporate leadership requires of them. In today's episode, the first of this series, I'm going to do a piece on Ben Packham. Ben has been a journalist for over 20 years and is currently the foreign affairs and defense correspondent for The Australian. Unsurprisingly, his Twitter feed is full of dozens and dozens of articles by ASPI, and he seems to consider them a pretty good source of information. This is a think tank who receives funds from the American government and the American military-industrial complex. They write China threat stories, fear-mongering day in and day out, and then their sponsors benefit directly and profit directly from the resulting China threat prevention measures that Australia takes. So, on to a story. He decided to write a story on Australia's Great Barrier Reef. How are we going to make this about foreign affairs and defense? And more importantly, how are we going to make this about China? Well, he must have told ASPI to hold his beer because he took out all of the stops. Let's start with the title. China-led ambush on health of the Great Barrier Reef. Ooh, this sounds serious. Let's take a look at some of the details inside. Australia has been blindsided by a push by a China-chaired UN committee to declare the Great Barrier Reef in danger without proper consultation or scientific process. Okay, wait, hang on a second. This immediately seems like an anticlimax right out of the gate. I was looking for how China was leading this ambush. Now I find out they're just the chair of the UN committee. Like, they're basically just the moderators for topics being presented before them. And Australia was blindsided, were they? Remember this point because it's going to be very important for the next paragraph. Australian government officials learned of the draft World Heritage Committee decision on Friday, despite an assurance just weeks ago from the Paris-based World Heritage Center that the reef's health status would not be downgraded. Okay. I got this. They were blindsided because they were having backroom conversations about how the verdict was supposed to go and how it was rigged. They weren't really blindsided by the effort because this has been years in the making. They were blindsided by the fact that their millions of dollars in lobbying money to keep the reef off an endangered list went to waste. This isn't really about China interfering with international systems. It's about Australia not being able to interfere enough with international systems and processes. Are we going to talk about that, Ben Packham? No? What about the $444 million in public funds given to a private foundation to try and keep the reef off an endangered list? That sounds pretty scandalous, doesn't it? No? Not interested? All right, okay, I get it. I guess it doesn't really play well into the China-led ambush narrative too well, does it, Ben? And ASPI is holding your beer after all. We don't want to let those guys down. Let's just cut to the chase here and see how Ben connects China to this effort further down. The move comes amid a surge in both Chinese influence and climate activism within the UNESCO system. Wait, that sounds kind of vague. And it's not really true again. The push has been years in the making and it had nothing to do with China. Are we just connecting random events here together? Is the real issue of being salty that the member states voted against the decision Australia was lobbying for? and your issue of being salty that China's influence is increasing? Are we just kind of linking these two things together or something here? Anyways, let's move on to the only other place where he makes this desperate attempt to link it to China. Australia is a member of the 21-nation World Heritage Committee, but the body, under the chairmanship of China's Vice Minister for Education, Tian Shijun, is considered likely to accept the recommendation. Okay, let's see what an Australian lawyer specializing in climate, clean energy, and environmental law has to say about this. The allegations are baseless. They are clearly being used to deflect from the Australian government's embarrassment. UNESCO draft decisions are written by the IUCN and UNESCO. World Heritage Committee members don't get to see them before they are released. So in other words, it doesn't matter if Tian Shijun accepts the recommendation or not. It's not up to him. In regards to that tweet from the lawyer, I'll only disagree with one small thing there. While it probably is being used as a tool of deflection, keep in mind we're talking about a guy here who's an ASPI-loving foreign affairs and defense correspondent. This is very much about continuing to beat the war drums and cultivate an anti-China sentiment. Australia isn't called America's deputy sheriff in the region for no reason. It's Ben's job to make sure your country does the best little job it can to live up to that name. Now, Ben received a lot of criticism on Twitter, and his main sticking point always seemed to be about an issue with the process, but never really substantially clarifying what exactly that means, what part of the process. He didn't really list out specific details. The only thing I can think of here is that usually there's a process where Australia lobbies people, spends a lot of money, and then gets what it wants. Are we just looking at kind of a hissy fit here that the normal behind-the-scenes collusion didn't work this time? Is that what this is all about? Now, Beijing also apparently criticized this baseless accusation against them, and Ben wrote a follow-up article. He didn't really correct himself in any meaningful way. Instead of making bold, sweeping statements and conclusions like he did in his first China-led ambush article, he instead took a more, he said, she said approach, saying things like, China has rejected suggestions that it played a role in a draft in danger classification for the Great Barrier Reef as totally groundless smears and slander. Why do you have to write it like that? This is verifiable. They actually didn't have anything to do with the draft. You can talk to the people who have been working on this for years. They're all over your Twitter mentions. Why don't you have a conversation with one of them? We see what you're doing here, Ben. In the absence of any kind of substance to really blame China and pin it on them in any meaningful way, he doesn't actually even directly mention very clearly that the decision was made by 21 member states. What he does do is he jumps directly into just saying that 14 of the 21 members signed up for Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, and that the Australian government believes the decision was politically motivated. All right, so we're building a conspiracy theory now? Trying to discredit the countries who voted in a way that wasted all of Australia's lobbying dollars? How dare they? And simultaneously accusing Beijing of using BRI leverage to try and force them to protect the Great Barrier Reef? Out of spite, apparently, I guess. You don't really say, and you don't provide any evidence. On the contrary, we have actual evidence that it was Australia trying to influence the decision in a specific direction. And even admitting in this article that the Australian government will heavily lobby members of the committee to push back against the draft ruling. They're not even going to stop now. They're still going to be throwing money at this. Are you seeing this? This is your conspiracy right here in front of your eyes. You even typed out those words, but you're still going after China for this, trying to build this China angle. Australia is the one trying to infiltrate and influence the global system. Seriously, Ben, come on. At least don't be so obvious when you're doing this stuff. If you were a real journalist doing real journalism, you wouldn't ignore what's right in front of your face. You'd be looking into where those hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying dollars were spent. You'd be looking into how frequently Australia tries to influence international systems to vote in a particular way. You'd be asking how much money overall is spent on these kinds of backroom collusion efforts. You'd be asking, how is it spent? Where is it going? Whose pockets are it ending up in? Or more importantly, maybe, you'd look into a very serious issue that's revealed in your own reporting. Your environment minister, Susan Ley, said that someone at UNESCO made assurances about how the vote would go. When you reached out to UNESCO, Dr. Fanny Duvert said that's simply not true. That's not how things are done. So now, what we have here is either Susan Ley is lying, or she has someone in UNESCO breaking the process while complaining about processes being broken. I mean, that's pretty big. I mean, I get it, though. You've been so focused on this China angle all this time that this blew right past your head. Now that I pointed this out to you, why don't you press Susan Lay to find out whether she's lying or breaking the rules with someone? But you won't do that, will you, Ben? And the reasons are obvious. Because you are a mainstream media shill. And that concludes my first episode of Mainstream Media Shills. I will leave you with some additional reading material if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the actual urgent issues at play here with the Great Barrier Reef. I'll share an 8-minute ABC interview with Professor Terry Hughes, who's with the ARC Center of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. In this interview, ABC, of course, tries to throw in a China angle, which Terry responds to directly. Then I will also share a link to another 9-minute ABC interview with Imogen Zaythoven, if I hope I've pronounced that correctly, who is a consultant for the Australian Marine Conservation Society, who's been working on this issue for years. And finally, I will also share a link with you that shows Imogen's direct response to Ben's article. Again, she believes this is about deflection, and I'll say the same thing. It probably is, but there's another more important element at play here with the whole anti-China narrative. So that's going to be it for me. Let me know what you think about this series. I've got a bunch of other journalists I want to do pieces on and really point out in black and white what they're trying to do here, the kind of dishonest twists and turns they make, and just try to help equip people a little bit better to see through this stuff on their own, because we've got to do something different. People keep getting fooled by this stuff. Anyways, as I said, that's it for me, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.
No, it's nonsense. The thing is that these people who work in Western think tanks, first of all, they have to say what needs to be said and what is acceptable. Otherwise, they'll lose their jobs. And I know of people who have lost their jobs. Flint Leverett, who was in the White House, he was the head of the Middle East and the National Security Council. After he had left, he went to the New America Foundation, and then he started saying things about Iran that were not popular in the establishment, and he was, thrown out. So, and you know as well as I, you know better than I, that people in the U.S. establishment, people in government, are taken care of afterwards. And his wife, who's Jewish, Hillary, she also had critical views of the United States. She has critical views of the United States, and she was educated at Harvard. She started teaching Middle Eastern studies at a university, and then, although for 2 years in a row she was considered the best professor by the students at that school, she was expelled ultimately. So these are people who worked in the White House.
Yeah.
Flint resigned over the Iraq War, but they were in the National Security Council. These were, heavyweights, and completely expelled. So if you want to have a job at a good think tank or in media, then you're not going to say the sort of things that Rania says on her show. That's a fact. So these people are going to say what needs to be said. Every now and then they have to be creative because they can't repeat the same thing over and over again.